As was stated, I am a scientist. So we're going to get a little bit real here. I'm actually a microbiologist. I'm getting my PhD in microbiology. I'm in my 5th year. So considering everything that's going on in the world right now, we're in the 3rd year of a pandemic, I think it's only really appropriate that we talk about plants. It's what's kept us all alive. I finally got myself some houseplants. I'm not very good at taking care of them, but I still love them. Okay, so why would a microbiologist want to talk to you guys about plants? Well, the truth is, in my lab, we study symbiosis. We study the symbiosis between plants and microbes. But today, I want to talk about a different symbiosis. I want to talk about the symbiosis between plants and people. And yes, this is me right in the middle. This is my trophy from my last harvest. I study cowpeas. So we call the symbiosis between plants and people domestication. And this was supposed to be a cool drop. I didn't know I was going last, but you guys already know that we're talking about domestication today. That's totally fine. Let's talk about food. Everything that we would call food is plants, or eats something that eats plants. So it doesn't matter what your personal diet is, it's still based on plants. But when we go to the grocery store, the fruits and vegetables that you see there are going to look a lot different from the fruits and vegetables that our ancestors ate. So I want to play a little bit of a game with you guys. You're pretty smart. I'm going to show you guys pictures of wild plants, and I want you to guess their domesticated counterparts. And we're going to start super easy. Just shout it out. What do we think?
Strawberry.
Tomato. Nice work. Very smart. Ace for all of you. All right, what about this one? Corn. We got it. Right up here. Nice work. All right, and this is our bonus round. This one has 6 possible answers. So just start shouting them out, folks. Cauliflower, broccoli, yes. What else? Brussels sprouts, yes. Cabbage, yes.
Celery?
Not celery.
Lettuce.
Not zucchini. Cabbage, yes. And I don't think anyone's gonna get the last one. The last one's kohlrabi. Does anyone know what kohlrabi is? Yeah, let's hear it for kohlrabi. All right. So yeah, this here on the left is what's called wild mustard, and yeah, it's the progenitor for all 6 of these vegetables. They're all the same species. Isn't that pretty cool? Domestication. What a concept. All right, so how exactly do we get from this to this? Yeah, I know it's domestication, but like more specifically, what do we think? Any guesses? Breeding, genetics. Let's get more specific. Selection, even more specific. What are we selecting?
Domestication.
Mutation. Mutation is at the foundation of all of these great answers that you guys are shouting out. Mutation actually happens all the time in nature. It's not necessarily something that we're doing to these plants, it's something that's just happening. So it can happen for all kinds of reasons. For one, DNA replication happens a lot in cells, and a lot of times they make mistakes, and sometimes they don't catch their mistakes. Could also come from radiation in the environment. That's pretty common. And I also actually just learned this last week, and it can actually come from extreme weather conditions, like extreme cold. That can actually cause mutations in the plants. I didn't know this. So what's actually going on here in this selection process? So wild plants are going to hold on to mutations that help them survive in the wild, obviously. We come into the picture, we want to pick the mutations that make it good for us. We want plants with big fruit, juicy, tastes delicious. We want it to last a long time. We want it to produce a ton. We want it to be easy to transport, easy to travel, easy to grow. These are not necessarily the mutations that the plants want to hold on to themselves, but we're the ones that are picking them. That's artificial selection, and it's a big part of how domestication works. So I want to talk you through an example of how this might happen. These are all what's called beech strawberries. They're one of the wild ancestors of the strawberries that we eat today. All of these up here, they're different varieties. They have different mutations in them, make them very different. Just looking at these strawberries up here, imagine that you lived in a place where all of these grew naturally, and you had to decide which ones you wanted to keep growing in your little garden. I bet most of you have already picked which one you think is most delicious. What would you pick?
Large white one.
The large white one. All right. What about you? What was your favorite?
The pet.
Pet. You chose correctly. I'm just kidding. That was just my favorite too. So if this was my garden, I would choose pet. I think it's, a good combination of size and redness, things that I like in a berry. So if I were to choose that one and pick a garden of them, this might be what my garden looks like. There's still a little bit of variation there, but they're all starting to look kind of the same. They're all the big red kind that I like. Now imagine if we did this generation after generation. I keep picking my favorite and just growing from that. Imagine how much change we could get, say, in 100 years, maybe even 1,000 years. Corn was domesticated in Mexico 9,000 years ago. Wheat was domesticated in the Middle East 10,000 years ago, so this isn't something that we just invented. This was all going on way before we knew anything about DNA, anything about genes. We didn't know what we were doing, but we were still doing it. Humans are really cool like that. So the folks of you in the audience who are really invested in eating natural foods that have as little influence from humans as possible, you might be freaking out right now. Have we been eating frankenfood for 10,000 years? Maybe. But see, the thing that we have to remember, right, is all of this is coming from mutation. And like I said earlier, mutation is natural. It's something that is constantly going on in every living thing that has DNA. But just because it's natural, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad. There can be good mutations and there can be bad mutations, depending on what you want. And it's the same with domestication. Domestication is just a tool. It's just a tool for us to pick which mutations we like. And sometimes we choose well, and sometimes we choose badly. Let's look at an example of both. So we're going to come back to this game. What do we think this is? Banana. Okra, that's a really good guess. I love okra. It is a banana. So the one on the left is how wild bananas look. They were first domesticated about 5,000 years ago, but they didn't really start to look like the bananas we know today until the 1800s. So let's kind of look at this and see what's happened here. First of all, it lost its seeds. Now that's something that actually just happens in nature, but the way that it works is it went from 2 sets of chromosomes to 3. That's a pretty big shift. That's 50% more DNA. And we didn't have anything to do with it, it just happened. But of course we like that better. We like fruit that doesn't have a ton of seeds in it. And then after that, there were other mutations to make it turn yellow, to make them bigger, to make them more delicious, to make them taste good. Whoop. Spoiler alert. If you go to any supermarket in America, or anywhere around the world for that matter, the bananas that you can buy there all look exactly the same. And that's actually because they're all clones. See, because they don't have seeds, they're actually sterile. And because we like consistency, we want to be able to go to the store and get the same banana every time. We just keep cloning the same plant. Everywhere around the world, the same plant. But the problem is that we have the same plant everywhere around the world. They have all of the same weaknesses. And it would be pretty easy to wipe them out. And that's actually what happened in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, there was a type of banana that was sold everywhere. It was called, and I'm going to butcher this because I don't know French, I swear to God, it's called the Gros Michel. And it's the banana that all of your grandparents probably grew up eating. But I've never had a Gros Michel banana, and I'm guessing nobody in the audience has, and that's because in the 1950s, there was a disease called Fusarium wilt that came through and wiped them all out, because they were all clones. There was no diversity there. There were no mutations to be had that could possibly protect bananas. And the bad news is that the bananas that we have today are about to go through the same thing. Because we didn't learn our lesson. We're still doing the same exact shit. So all of the bananas that we have are clones, and they're getting wiped out by the same exact disease, Fusarium wilt. Yeah, so within our lifetime, we're probably gonna see bananas part 3, and maybe even part 4, and hopefully at some point, we'll try to do something different. So let's talk about course correction. The example that I just gave was kind of a bummer. So let's talk about some ways that we can use domestication for good. Let's talk about Brussels sprouts. So I grew up hating Brussels sprouts, and I'm sure the same is true for a lot of you guys because I thought they tasted like garbage, but everyone ate them and I didn't understand why. If you've been to a restaurant sometime in the last few years, they've gotten very popular again, and shocking to say, they actually taste really good. And it's not just that I grew up and started liking vegetables, excuse me, they actually changed Brussels sprouts. This is pretty crazy. So it turns out that over generations, they had been breeding Brussels sprouts to be bigger and hardier because that's what sells. They didn't realize they were breeding them to have higher concentrations of something called glucosinolates, and that's what makes them taste really bitter. So eventually, scientists were able to figure out why the Brussels sprouts we had were tasting so bad. They went back to the drawing board, looked at some older varieties that had lower levels of these nasty, nasty compounds, and they bred them together. In the 1990s, they took the older varieties that tasted good but were small, and the newer varieties that were big but tasted like shit. They bred them together, and we got amazing Brussels sprouts. Pretty incredible what science can do when we put our heads together and actually pay attention. So maybe this is what's going to save us. Maybe looking at domestication, we need to be focusing on blending the best of both worlds, the old and the new, wild and domesticated. Because wild plants, there's much more diversity there to be had. There's mutations that could help fight climate change. There's mutations that could help them be drought resistant. But the problem with wild plants is, like you guys have seen, it doesn't even look like food. There's like not much there. We don't want to go back to that. It's not enough to feed us, because that's the other side of this equation. We need to be able to keep feeding people, especially as our population expands. Domesticated fruits and vegetables are great, because they're big and juicy and generally taste good, but they might not have that diversity. They don't have those possible genetic mutations that might help them survive what's coming. So a lot of the best science that's happening right now is, like I said, going back to the drawing board, looking at what we have and what we used to have. How can we have the best of both worlds? Using a combination of breeding techniques, genetic techniques, yes, GMOs. I think this is what's going to save us. Ooh, going backwards, going forwards. The food that we eat is going to continue to change, and that's okay, because we've changed, and our world and environment are changing. We need all of the tools in our tool belt if we're going to be able to survive the next several hundred years at the very least. And domestication is one of those tools. And like I said, it can be used poorly, it can be used well, but if we learn to do our best, it's going to keep us alive. Thanks.